Our next speaker is Paul Kramer.
First, I'd just like to thank Arcadio and the other organizers for the chance to speak here. This is really an honor, and I'd like to thank Damaris for all of her assistance in getting me here. My comments today are going to address the question of how we historicize migration and colonialism together, and specifically the way that we might think about the history of migration to the United States in light of the history of Puerto Rican migration. So what does the history of the intersections of Puerto Rico and the US and migration tell us about the broader role of the US in the world and of ways we might write immigration history differently? And I want to begin with a phrase that has really haunted me ever since I first heard it. I first heard it in the context of listening to immigrant rights activists in the UK protesting against racist nativism and for immigrant rights in the 1980s. And their slogan that they were using in marches and protests was, "We are here because you were there." We are here because you were there. Now, there are analytical problems with this slogan, as there are with all slogans. It establishes a kind of simple cause-effect relationship, right? The British Empire goes out, West Indian sort of migrants from all over the British Empire make their way back to the metropole. It doesn't specify specific causes and effects, right? How do we get from imperial intervention to long-distance migration? It doesn't specify the ways that migration often occurs for reasons that don't have to do with empire, for example. So to play devil's advocate, there are all kinds of things that this slogan leaves out. It also doesn't leave a lot of room for agency, right? It creates the sense of a kind of automatic relationship between projections of power from the global north and migrations reacting more or less by reflex from the global south. And finally, my quarrel with this term is that it's a slogan on the defensive in a way. It's an argument that's meant to counter increasingly aggressive arguments about why migrants should not be in the metropole. It's an argument that in an increasing range of contexts in the United States and globally, we're finding that migrants and their allies find that they are in need of answering to engaging this question about worthiness, about deservingness. And it's a question that unfortunately many migrants and their allies feel that they need to engage. I think it says a lot about the current state of politics in the United States and globally, that this is where the conversation is. Now, all that said, and all those sort of quibbles with this slogan, here's what I like about the slogan. And here's why I think it's actually quite useful in making sense of the history of Puerto Rican migration to the United States and broader histories of the United States and empire. First, this slogan, "We are here because you were there," implies a rights claim that is not routed through juridical citizenship. It's a kind of structural claim. And it implies a set of dispossessions and displacements. It embeds the question of migration and the rights of migrants in a broad set of questions that ultimately take us to the politics of transnational, imperial, and global inequality. Second, when applied to the United States, this phrase most basically insists that there is such a thing as U.S. imperial history, which we shouldn't forget in the larger public culture is still a hotly debated question. So if we use this phrase to speak to immigration history to the United States, it reminds us and reminds Americans that the US was, and often enough still is, out there, right? In many cases, generating migrations or instigating migrations that end up here. And that itself has an important role in countering exceptionalist denials about the nature of American power in the world. The slogan also foregrounds dynamics of displacement and dispossession in migration history, which I think is important in light of the fact that, at least within the US literature about immigration, there tends to be an emphasis on pull factors that sort of pull people in to receiving societies. There's an attention to cultural adjustment and adaptation, the kind of resourcefulness with which migrants assimilate, don't assimilate, retain cultures, reconfigure new hybrid cultures, etc. But there's been much less attention over the years to these questions about push factors, right? The structural conditions that underpin and shape migration in the first place. Now, I think over the last couple of decades, we've seen more and more transnational immigration history that has brought in a much wider set of geographies for understanding migration history. Looking at, for example, the impact of migrants on their home societies, the ways that migration is a multi-directional phenomenon, often a seasonal phenomenon, right? And talking about the ways that migrants don't just impact receiving societies, but are in a kind of constant circulation with respect to societies that they, in fact, are connecting, right? That the kind of tissues of transnationalism are being built by migrants' lives themselves. Now, one of the things that I think, though, that this slogan does and kind of helps us frame our inquiries is that alongside these questions about cultural hybridity and adaptation, it foregrounds the role of coercion and violence in making it impossible or difficult for people to thrive where they are. That it restores a sense of tragic necessity to many migration histories, which unfortunately, at least within the context of US immigration history, have tended to celebrate arrival, rediscovery, reinvention, right? A kind of American-centered narrative about how migration is about renewing oneself and in the process renewing the United States. So there's a kind of romanticized celebration of mobility, of reinvention, et cetera. And I think it's important to keep in mind, particularly in the present context, the importance of understanding displacement and dispossession in this context. It prompts us to think about what immigrant rights activists have called a right to stay home. And it makes us ask about the structural forces and policy regimes that deny many people that right. Okay. Now, along with this, I think, and importantly, and what the stakes of this framework are for me, have to do with a politics and an ethics. The traditional way in which migration has been understood in so-called receiving societies is as a gift, right? As a benefit that sovereign states give to outsiders, right? It's conditional, it can be retracted, right? They can be enforced in sovereign terms at the border or within the society. And in a way, that basic fact structures a whole set of conversations about politics and ethics within those societies and between those societies and the wider world. What "we are here because you are there" does is it implies that immigrant receiving societies may owe something to migrants, not because they provide labor power or cultural richness and diversity, or because they're so-called deserving or worthy, but rather because those societies played a fundamental role in displacing and uprooting migrants from their home societies, whether through invasions, whether through colonial occupations and regimes, proxy wars, support for repressive governments, disruptive trade agreements, or global environmental crises in which the global north is disproportionately implicated. This framing also calls upon us to think about the need to challenge some of the kind of tidy spatial containers that we think about, even in terms of the categories of sending and receiving societies. What the slogan does in part is it implies that the so-called receiving societies were already deeply present, intrusively present, in the societies of migrants even before they ever left home. And for this reason, I think it actually forces us to challenge and perhaps even discard the category of immigrant itself. If we think about immigrant, it's about the status of a human being moving across a national border from an outside to an inside, right? But within the framework that I'm advancing here, again, inspired by this slogan, the idea is that when a British Indian subject sort of moves to the British metropole, he's not an immigrant, right? When a West Indian migrant worker arrives in London, she's not an immigrant. She's already internal to a power system long before he or she ever leaves home. So what this framework allows us to see is the ways in which migrants are often enmeshed in long-distance fields of power and force that are already present well beyond territorial borders. And this framework is one that some of the basic spatial and geographic categories of sovereignty and some of the mundane dimensions of just looking at a map with those tidy kind of jigsaw lines, right, discourages to see these spatialities in which migrants are already entangled in these broader forces. And I think that changes our sense of politics and ethics in potentially transformative ways. Now, in ways that are probably obvious, Puerto Rican migration history to the mainland United States is in many ways ideally suited to open up exactly this question, perhaps better than any other migration history. The one other exception being Filipino migration history, which is something I've looked at in my own prior research. The traditional paradigm of US immigration history was founded between roughly the 1930s and 1950s. The archetypal immigrant was free, a kind of voluntary migrant, and was also European. And the entire edifice of scholarship and knowledge about what immigration was built precisely around these kind of migrants. What I'm asking here is, what would it mean if we developed a new paradigm, self-consciously built around the dynamics of a post-1945 migration history to the United States? This, of course, is a period that in many respects begins with the takeoff of mass Puerto Rican migration, especially to the East Coast. We could call this paradigm an imperial history of migration. And it would be a paradigm self-consciously crafted within an era of US global hegemony to make sense of migrations that were profoundly shaped by that hegemony. One of the most striking statistics that I've seen was a chart where if you look at the largest sending countries of migrants to the United States on the 2010 census, if you look at like the top, I think it's the top 15, all but one of them are countries that the United States has invaded or occupied at one time in its history. Now, admittedly, this is not an especially refined criteria. We'd expect large migrations from China and India, for example, by virtue of the scale of their populations. And in some cases on that list, the linkages between specific interventions and migration are thin to non-existent, right? So US-Mexico migration, for example. But nonetheless, as a kind of rough heuristic about the importance of putting questions of hegemonic power from the global north and migration history into some sort of dialogue, I feel like that's a fairly nice rough approximation. Now, from this perspective, Puerto Rican migration history, which has not been central to the canonical US immigration historiography, goes from being on the margins to in many ways becoming the center. Now, I myself am not a primary document researcher of Puerto Rican migration history. But I am an enthusiastic and appreciative reader of secondary works. And so from here on out, I'm going to be relying heavily on my readings of a number of wonderful published and emerging works by Efren, by Cesar Ayala, by Edgardo Melendez in his brand new book, Sponsored Migration, which is terrific, and my friend Robert McGreevy, his book, forthcoming, Borderline Citizens, which is a terrific look at the relationship between migration from Puerto Rico to the mainland in the early 20th century. These are all the books that are kind of informing my reading here today. Now, reading through this secondary literature, I'm struck by three overarching ways that we can see these dynamics of migration and empire being conjugated together. Dispossession, recruitment, and what we might call safety valve strategies. I'll just go through each of these very, very briefly. So dispossession. So one of the things that becomes very clear reading this literature is the ways in which US colonial policy at the level of technology, economics, commerce, have profoundly shaped the political economy, obviously of Puerto Rico, in ways that have had both direct and mediated impacts on generating out-migration. You can talk about colonial trade policies that displaced thousands of coffee workers in the early 20th century. We talked about the 1920 Jones Act and the way that that raises the cost of imports to Puerto Rico. Colonial land policies under the United States that favor the concentration of land in the hands of large sugar planters, displacing smaller farmers. We can also talk about the differential modes of subordinating citizenship that have already come up in the conference. So the 1922 Balzac decision, for example, that ties the exercise of US citizenship to presence in the mainland. We can also talk about Puerto Rico's exclusion from some of the basic social protections of the New Deal during the 1930s. Many of those protections were not actually advanced until the 1950s, and then only in a very partial and discriminatory way. This obviously feeds into highly differential reimbursement rates for Medicaid. And most directly and forcefully, when it comes to these forces of dispossession, in which we see US policy in the island shaping the distribution of power and resources in ways that could uproot people from the island. Most directly and forcefully, we have the uprooting of communities that are in the way of US military bases, right? The communities of Vieques, for example, that are forced out of their homes and communities in order to make room for both the base and the bombing testings that occurred there. So in all these ways, we can talk about the forces of dispossession. Again, not making immigration happen, but creating conditions in which the right to stay home is being compromised or violated in profound ways that are going to force people to make creative decisions about survival and about thriving through mobility. All right, a second mechanism that we can see empire and migration operating together is recruitment. And this involves US state authorities and authorities in the island mobilizing Puerto Rican workers as labor forces in a variety of capacities to see the Puerto Rican population as a potentially mobile labor force in a variety of different settings. So for example, the fact that Puerto Rico is exempted from the terms of the contract labor laws in the United States means that from virtually the instant that the US establishes some kind of sovereignty there, you have labor recruiters in the island trying to recruit workers that can travel really throughout a kind of large-scale imperium to work in areas where they're highly vulnerable, highly exploitable, but again, because the contract labor laws don't allow the pre-recruitment of workers from the other side of US borders, right? I mean, the famous case, of course, being the early 20th century Puerto Rican recruitment to Hawaii, right? This is a geographically unlikely labor migration, right? But it isn't in the era of high imperialism, and particularly in the case where the US is trying to navigate how to make a labor system work within the constraints of this immigration regime. We see Puerto Rican workers becoming, in many ways, the key military labor force in the larger US Caribbean basing structure in the early 20th century. The proximity to military facilities like the Panama Canal, to the base at Guantanamo, mean that Puerto Ricans are going to be essential for the kind of building of a militarized empire in the Caribbean. Again, creating migratory networks both within the Caribbean and on the mainland in ways that are perceived to serve the larger interests of American power. By the mid-20th century, the Puerto Rican government begins to work to serve as a kind of de facto labor broker, providing both formal and informal means to recruit Puerto Rican farm labor, Puerto Rican industrial labor, often promising some degree of accountability and regulation, often very thin in practice. But again, the sense that recruitment, right, is going to generate these networks of mobility to serve both private interests and the US state. And finally, there's this question of what we might call safety valve strategy. And this was a case in which, remarkably, you have officials in the island that begin to think about the mainland political economy and political space as a kind of safety valve to which people should be encouraged to migrate from the island in order to alleviate overpopulation, is a term we've talked about already. This is parallel to similar moves that are happening in other parts of the US empire, and especially in the mid-20th century. The sense that the best way to stabilize areas that are crucial for American power is to try to manage population in a way that doesn't lead to destabilizing misery, right? Or people protesting and pursuing radical options, right? And so what's remarkable, particularly in terms of the contemporary nativist context, right, is the notion that actually achieving power out there requires domestic political space to take on lots of immigrants and to be able to provide jobs, right, potentially welfare systems, et cetera. But this becomes a major sort of response by Puerto Rican officials in the mid-20th century. The sense that migrants will be kind of safer vis-a-vis these projections of American power if they're inside rather than outside. Again, this is almost unthinkable in terms of contemporary imaginaries. But really at the high tide of the Cold War, this becomes something that characterizes US approaches to Puerto Rico, also to Mexico, parts of Eastern Europe, et cetera. And of course, the key discursive piece of this is this term overpopulation, right? Which itself organizes a kind of internal exit, right? The notion that voice will not be exercised in the island itself. And it generates a kind of statistical narrative that opposes land reform, that opposes redistributionist politics, and turns what are essentially political and economic problems into demographic and statistical problems. Now, to emphasize these particular imperial strategies is not in any way to minimize agency of migrants themselves. At every stage, Puerto Rican migrant workers negotiated and navigated these imperial structures in remarkable and resourceful ways. It's Isabel Gonzalez, after all, and her legal team that forces the United States to redefine her status and that of other Puerto Ricans as not alien to this new external sovereignty. It's post-1945 migration to the United States by thousands of Puerto Rican workers that compel the Puerto Rican state and the US state to try to accommodate them within American political economy. And ultimately, it's Puerto Rican workers' use of the fact that they can't be deported as US citizens that give them a certain amount of leverage and power in their contest with employers. This said, I think the analysis of Puerto Rican migration through the lens of empire and empire through the lens of migration can help shed new light on the story of the Puerto Rican diaspora, as many of the works I've emphasized today are already doing. And I think, as I said, I think this case gives us the ability to shed light on broader stories about the US and the world. It helps us make sense as well of Southeast Asian migrations to the United States during the Vietnam War, Middle Eastern migrations to the United States in the aftermath of 9/11. The history of Puerto Rican migration can help us ask ourselves and answer the extent to which it makes sense to talk about the United States in past and present as an empire of migrants. Thanks.